When you stand here, where so many great preachers have spoken, I'm reminded of the words of William James Bryan at the 1896 Democratic Convention. He stood before a deadlocked convention and he said, "It would be highly presumptuous of me to come before this aggregation if this were a mere measuring of ability. But the humblest saint, when clad in the garb of a righteous cause, is able to overcome all the host of error." And while I would certainly say that the people here are not the host of error, I do hope and pray that what I have to share with you today is a righteous cause. Homiletically, this will probably be very poor. However, I want to share with you what is really a deep, abiding passion of my heart. And I'm going to open it up with just some anecdotes to kind of paint a backdrop for it. I coach my son's baseball team. And a fellow I coach with is a guy named Matt Kimbrough. And Matt has said that I really don't know if today's kids as baseball players are more talented than kids are when I was growing up. But I do know, though, they have more opportunity. He said, "Charlie, when you and I were growing up, there was no such thing as T-ball. There was no such thing as coach pitch baseball. It was all kid pitch. And kid pitch baseball is far more difficult for the batter than is coach pitch or T-ball." He said that the leagues now are all age specific. You have a 8-year-old league, a 9-year-old league, a 10-year-old league, and so forth. Back then, it was 7-year-old through 12-year-olds. You'd have this big, giant 12-year-old kid pitching to a little 7-year-old. It's a lot harder. Now they have clinics for coaches and how to teach drills and learning baseball skills. He said, "I know the baseball players are better today, but I don't know if they are more talented or it's just that they have a better opportunity and they're better coached." Too many times I have found myself talking to parents about spiritual commitment in children, and I get this response: "Charlie, you really take Christianity too seriously. You really don't have to be a super Christian. As long as you're born again and you're actually converted, that's enough to get by." And these people, I found myself, I've gotten to the point where I asked them a few questions. The first question is, what kind of grades do you expect your children to make in school? "I expect them to make A's and B's." "Oh, I understand. It's okay for your kids to make A's and B's. But in life, in the spiritual commitment, it's okay for them just to get by? Is that what you're saying?" Neither one of my parents ever set foot in a college classroom. Yet my brother and I have 7 degrees between us. It is a great characteristic of the World War II generation that they wanted their children to be better educated and to have more material possessions than did they. And to a great extent, this is true. They got their wish. That was their goal, and that's what they wanted, and that's what they achieved. For me, growing up, it was never a question of whether or not I would go to college. It was just so ingrained in me. Even in the height of my teenage rebellion, it never crossed my mind that I would not go to college. I always understood from day one I would go to higher education. I've been in a discipleship group with several guys for 7 years. One of the guys is our own Hamp Dye, who, as you know, is a gargantuan fan of the University of Mississippi. One day as we were getting started, Hamp just kind of laughingly said, "What would I do if my kids decide they didn't want to go to Ole Miss?" And Dr. Steve Davidson, who's in the group, just looked at Hamp straightforward and he said, "Hamp, it's not going to happen." He said, "Look at your life." He said, you take your children to Oxford for games several times a year. He said, you wear clothes with the school logo. You have memorabilia of the school around your house. You have modeled for them the University of Mississippi, and they will go to Ole Miss. Don't worry about it. I have several questions for you today. And the first is, Why is it that we disciple our children so passionately for sports and for schools? Why don't we also passionately disciple them into the ways of God? How many fathers play catch with their children in the backyard? Of course, most do. That's a very good thing. But also ask, how many fathers daily read the Bible to their children? How many fathers daily pray with their children one-on-one? How many fathers daily share godly principles with their children? When you have children, will it be okay for your children to make D's and F's in school, or just make straight D's just to get by? Of course not. Will it be okay for your children just to get by on spiritual matters and to effectively make D's in their spiritual life? Is it going to be naturally understood that your children will go to college from day one? Will it be naturally understood by your children that they are to grow up to be godly? Will it be naturally understood by your children that they are to grow up to marry someone godly? I share these things with people and I get this response sometimes. Come on, Charley. You're going way overboard here. After all, sports are a natural part of growing up. You play baseball, you play football, basketball. Going to college games, there's nothing wrong with that. And first, I never said sports were bad. I coach baseball. And I'll go you one better. Especially for boys, I think sports are very important. I agree with scholars that say that in our culture, sports have replaced the rights of manhood that are found in other cultures. Competitive sports carry the principles of hard work, struggle, discipline, and courage. I'm not a nut. I don't scream at the boys I coach. But I do push them to be better. I try to get them to do things they never believed they could have possibly been able to achieve. I coach my kids to win. But I know there's a much higher goal and a much higher objective than winning. Some of these boys come from unchristian homes. I want them to have a very good experience in their baseball life. And hopefully that experience will contribute to their manhood. And I want that leader of that experience to be someone who is modeling godly principles. As far as family trips go, I'm all for it. I want your children to grow up knowing that the Christian life is far more important than allegiance to a college football team. In the final analysis, these are players that you don't know, coached by people who you don't know, and they play for state institutions. Although it is on a very grand stage, is there really any difference between Ole Miss and Mississippi State playing football than the flag football games played by the Attorney General's office against the office of the Secretary of State? They're both state institutions. If your child's soccer team has a winning record, if your child is an honor student, if your school goes to a college football bowl game, so what? What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? In 1976, actually 1975, Jimmy Carter launched his successful campaign for the U.S. presidency. And if there was ever an unknown presidential candidate, it was Jimmy Carter. He began that with a book that he published that outlined his goals and his vision for America. And the title was, Why Not the Best? It's a great title. And for us, I ask for our children, why not the best? Why not have our children grow up to know more Bible, even as children, than the average adult? Why not actively model Christian principles? But we should let be known by our children daily that we expect our children to actually exceed the godliness in our own lives. Why not have our children grow up to really become spiritual giants, with each succeeding generation surpassing the godliness of the generation before it? Dr. Bill Urey's mother prayed constantly as he was growing up, not only that her children would be godly, but that God would scatter her children across the world. Mrs. Urey and her husband, Dr. Bill Urey Sr., live in Florida. Their son Hutch lives in Hong Kong. Their daughter lives in Brazil. Their son, Dr. Bill Urey, lives here in Jackson, Mississippi, where he prepares laborers for the harvest for both here and abroad. Vance Havner was a Southern Baptist minister who died in the early 1980s. And Vance Havner was a mentor to Dr. Billy Graham. Vance Havner bumped into a woman he had not seen in quite some time. And he was asking her about her son, who he had been in a church he had preached at many years before. And she said, "Oh, he's doing good. He's got this job as an executive at a company in Boston, Massachusetts. He's running right up the corporate ladder. He's doing good, Dr. Havner." Vance Havner said, "Where is he with God?" "Well, you know how kids are today. They grow up, and I know he's not involved in church. And I know he's gotten away from God, but he's doing good, Dr. Havner." He said, "Ma'am, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but your son's not doing good. He's backslidden, and his soul is in peril. There's a big difference between being a good boy and in being God's boy." My real goal for you this morning is not really to provide guilt. It's to provide a vision of discipleship for children, of how to mentor them in the ways of God. Perhaps you're single. So this doesn't apply to me. Oh no, I think it does apply to you. My goal here for you that are single is to instill a vision to pray for your children that have yet to be conceived. I want your minds and your hearts to expect your children to grow up to be more godly than you are. I want you to have a vision for your grandchildren to grow up to be more godly than your children that have yet to be conceived. In our family, we have from a very early age had nightly Bible lessons with our children. We have one-on-one prayer time with our children. I think it's very important for children to hear their parents appeal to God for their souls, for their hearts, for their minds, for their physical safety, their spiritual safety, and yes, even for their future spouse, for their future children, and their future grandchildren. I think it's important to worship at home with your children, for children to learn the great hymns of our faith. The 18th century preacher Charles Spurgeon grew up in the mid-1800s, and his grandmother worked a deal with him. She offered to pay him a penny for every hymn he memorized. Well, Charles Spurgeon became quite adept at this, and he memorized so many hymns she had to cut it back because she was running short on money. And finally, she had to call the deal off. He continued to memorize hymns. And as you read through his autobiography, you see from the first volume, in the early years of his ministry, to the full harvest, the second volume, the later years of his ministry, hymns he quotes sporadically throughout sermons, through business meetings, through sharing one-on-one with people. The truths of the great hymns of our faith became instilled in Charles Spurgeon, and they helped carry him when the soul was weary, and they helped him carry the message of God to other people. It's important to open our homes to invite fellow seminary students, ministers, missionaries, so that children can see the light of God in other people. This summer I bumped into Dr. Al Coppage, and he and I were talking. He shared with me, he thought perhaps the greatest thing he did as a father was he opened up his home in just this manner. They had a steady stream of missionaries, Christians from overseas, Christians from home, to come in so that his children could see the light of God in the lives of these people. And as you know, his son, Billy Coppage, is a recent graduate of this school. And just last week, Billy and his wife Joanna made their way to Uganda, where they are serving as missionaries. I might say that last week on his way to Uganda, Billy stopped off with his sister, and she and her husband are missionaries in Hungary. It's important to expose people to the light of God. We need to encourage, and I hate to say this, guys, we need to encourage men to take a leadership role, not only in the home, but in the church. I can't tell you how weary I've become in talking to men in the business world who blow me off, and they say, churches for women and children. Well, I hate to say it, but they come by this view honestly. Because if you go to the average church, if you look to see who's working with children, it's only women. These young boys do not grow up seeing strong, godly men model biblical principles. And so when they drop out of church as adolescents, as they're struggling and how they're going to reach manhood, they haven't had the mentoring. They have not had the example of godliness from godly men. And as a result, they grow up and they think church is for women and children. That the fault of that lies with us men. We have to overcome that in our own lives, and we've got to give that vision to other men. This past summer, our family made our annual trek to Indian Springs Holiness Camp. This is a great event in the lives of my children and for our whole family, but for my children it is especially so. In fact, it is no exaggeration on my part when I say that Indian Springs camp meeting is a much more exciting thing to my children than is Christmas. Indian Springs has an outstanding children's ministry led by our own Dr. Becky Lemon and led by our own board chair, Mrs. Beth Reed. But Indian Springs this year had a unique altar call and evening service for parents. The altar call was for parents to come forward and invited the parents to say yes to God if God happened to call their children into Christian service, and specifically into overseas missions. I went forward. Do you want my children to become missionaries? The natural Charley Artmann says no. The natural Charley Artmann says, I want my children and my grandchildren close by me. But I have to have the courage and the wisdom and the integrity not to stand in the way of the kingdom of God. If God calls them, not just to permit my children to go, but to encourage them and to undergird them with prayer. My goal is for each generation that follows me to be more godly than the one previous. In our home, we call it a legacy of increasing godliness. It is a dream of mine that one day my great-great-great-grandchildren will look back on their great-great-great-grandfather, Charley, and say, you know, he had limited knowledge of the Bible. I know his ministry wasn't that great. But bless God, he had the vision, and he prayed for the vision that spawned all these great ministries that we have before us. I ask you this morning to look deep within yourself, to look deep into the heart of Jesus. Develop a passion. Develop a vision for a legacy of increasing godliness that will grow and will deepen long after all of us have gone to heaven.